They didn't say I was excluded. They said I was strong enough. So I stood alone in a boatyard, hands burned by salt and resin, fixing what no one else would touch, on the busiest day of the week. That's when I realized sometimes independent isn't praise. It's permission to leave you behind. The boatyard sits right at the edge of the harbor, where the air always smells like salt and wet wood. That's where I spent most of my days. My name is Lena Walker, and for as long as I can remember, this place has been quieter than any room in my parents' house ever was. The yard wakes up early, gulls arguing over scraps, ropes knocking against metal posts, the slow groan of boats shifting with the tide. By the time most people pour their first coffee, my hands are already stiff from cold water and resin. I liked that. The work was honest. Boats don't care how you look. They only care if you did the job right. My mother used to call around mid-morning, not to ask how I was, just to check things. Her voice was always calm, polite, even. That was the part people never noticed. "Don't make a big deal out of it," she'd say. "Just keep your head down. You know how your sister is. This is important for her." She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. The words landed softly, like they were reasonable, like they were facts. At first, I thought that meant she was being kind. When you're young, you learn quickly which reactions are allowed. Crying made things worse. Explaining made you sound dramatic. Silence, though that worked. Silence kept the peace. Silence made you useful. So I learned it early. If something hurt, I didn't name it. I adjusted. I showed up. I fixed what needed fixing. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what strong people did. The thing about being told you're fine is that no one checks after that. People would point to me and say, "Lena's good. She can handle it." And because I did handle it, they stopped looking any closer. They stopped asking questions. They stopped offering help. There's a kind of child every family praises. The easy one, the dependable one, the one who never asks for much. On the outside, that child looks lucky. On the inside, that child is learning how to disappear without leaving the room. I didn't know there was a word for it back then. I just knew that if something needed to be done, it usually ended up in my hands, a loose plank on a boat that wasn't even ours. Paperwork my father didn't want to deal with. Repairs no one else had time for. Whenever I hesitated, my mother's voice would slide in, smooth as ever. "You're better at this. You don't mind. You're strong." Strong became a reason, a justification, an ending to every conversation. The strange part is how normal it all felt. That's what repetition does. It turns neglect into routine. It turns dismissal into background noise. I remember standing in the yard one afternoon, covered in sawdust, watching my sister's photos pop up online. Smiling faces, clean clothes, perfect angles. People commenting about how proud her family must be. No one ever asked who kept things running behind the scenes. When my mother called that day, her tone didn't change. Not even a little. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask where I was. She went straight to logistics. "It would just be easier if you didn't come," she said. "Tonight's about image. You understand that?" I understood exactly what she meant. I always did. What she didn't say was louder than anything she could have shouted. That my presence was inconvenient. That my work was acceptable as long as it stayed out of sight. That I was valuable, but not presentable. I stood there with my hands resting on the hull of a half-finished boat, still warm from the sun. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't argue. I waited for the call to end. Afterward, I noticed something small. My shoulders were tight. like they always got when I swallowed a feeling instead of letting it pass. I leaned against the workbench and waited for the familiar urge to explain myself. It didn't come. That scared me more than the call itself. Because when you've been quiet your whole life, the moment you stop needing to defend yourself feels unfamiliar, almost wrong. I started thinking back, not to one moment, but to dozens of them, none dramatic on their own, just small instructions repeated over time. Be patient, be flexible, don't take it personally. That's how silence is taught. Not with cruelty, but with consistency. Families rarely say, "We're putting this on you." They say, "You're the only one who can handle it." And when you accept that role long enough, it stops feeling like a choice. Standing there in the yard, tide creeping in, I realized something I'd never let myself think before. Being okay all the time had made me invisible, not because I wasn't worth seeing, but because no one had been asked to look. If you're listening to this and part of it feels uncomfortably familiar, you're not imagining things. The people who carry the most often make the least noise, and that's exactly why they're left carrying it alone. I stayed in the yard until the light shifted and the boats cast longer shadows. I went back to work, not because I had to, because it was what I knew how to do, but something had already changed. I wasn't quiet because I was weak anymore. I was quiet because I was paying attention. I didn't notice it at first, because nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt practical, necessary. The kind of thing you don't question when you're used to being the one who steps in. The first time I stayed late, it was because a boat was leaking and the owner needed it ready by morning. I told myself it was temporary, just this once. I worked under a single light until my hands cramped and my phone battery died. When I finally locked up, it was almost dawn. No one asked how it went. After that, it happened more often. A call after midnight, a text that just said, "Can you handle this?" I always did. Not because I wanted credit, because if I didn't, the problem would still be there in the morning. I became the person things defaulted to. If paperwork was confusing, it landed on my desk. If a repair went wrong, my name was the one attached to fixing it. If someone needed a favor, they already knew who to call. I told myself this was trust, that being relied on meant I mattered. There were months when my fridge stayed mostly empty. I'd forget to shop, forget to eat, forget to stop. The work came first. It always did. Boats don't wait for you to feel balanced. Bills don't care if you're tired. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the workshop window late at night. Grease on my face, hair pulled back too tight. I'd think about how different my life looked from the outside. Solid, stable, unbothered. That image followed me everywhere. When my parents talked about me, they didn't mention the hours or the repairs. They said things like, "Lena's got it covered," or, "She's always been the responsible one." It sounded like praise. It landed like an expectation. The strange thing is, no one ever asked if I wanted that role. I started noticing patterns, small ones. When something went right, it belonged to the family. When something went wrong, it quietly became mine. I signed documents so other people didn't have to. I absorbed stress so other people could stay comfortable. If you're listening to this and thinking, "That sounds familiar," you already know what comes next. There's a moment when you realize you're not just helping, you're holding everything up. I remember one night in particular. A storm rolled in fast, and a boat broke loose from its mooring. I spent hours in the rain, pulling lines, securing damage, calling insurance reps who wouldn't answer until morning. By the time I got home, my clothes were soaked through. My hands were shaking from cold. The next day, my sister posted photos from a fundraiser, clean dress, perfect lighting. comments full of praise. Someone wrote, "Your family must be so proud." I stared at that line longer than I should have, because they were proud, just not of the part that kept everything running. I didn't complain. I didn't think I was allowed to. Complaining felt like weakness, and I had been taught, very carefully, that weakness was inconvenient. So I stayed quiet. I stayed useful. The more I did, the more invisible it became. That's the trick of it. Consistency erases effort. Reliability turns into entitlement. There were times I tried to slow down, just a little. I'd say I was busy or tired. The response was always the same tone, calm, mildly disappointed. "You're the only one who knows how this works. It'll fall apart without you. I thought you cared." Cared. That word did a lot of work. Every time I heard it, I pushed a little further past my own limits. I told myself this was what family meant, that this was the price of belonging. But belonging shouldn't feel like exhaustion you carry alone. One afternoon, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in years. Old invoices, old contracts. My name kept appearing in places I didn't remember agreeing to. Responsibility without recognition, liability without authority. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, recognition. I wasn't just helping anymore. I was buffering everyone else from consequences. If a project failed, it wouldn't be their problem. It would be mine. If a deal went wrong, my name was already there. If someone got praised, they stood in the light. If someone got blamed, I was close enough to catch it. That's when the story changed for me. Not because anything exploded, but because I finally saw the shape of it. How long it had been happening. How quietly. I wondered what would happen if I stopped. Just for a day. Just for a moment. The thought scared me, not because I didn't think I could survive, but because I knew how many things were balanced on my silence. I went back to work that evening. Same routine, same tools, same quiet. But my hands felt heavier. Every bolt I tightened felt like a question. If you were me, would you keep going? Would you keep proving your worth by preventing problems that no one else wanted to see? I locked up late again that night. The harbor was still. The boats barely moved. Everything looked fine from a distance. And that was the problem. Because when everything keeps working, no one asks who's holding it together. They came back when they needed something. Not slowly, not carefully. Suddenly. Like the problem had just appeared, even though it had been building for weeks. My phone lit up while I was in the yard, hands deep in a toolbox. I didn't answer right away. I already knew the tone before I heard it. "There's a deadline," my mother said. "This can't wait. We're counting on you." No greeting, no pause. Just instructions. They didn't ask if I was available. They told me what had to be done. A donor visit. A boat that needed to look flawless. A situation that could not fail. Their words moved fast, stacked on top of each other, like urgency itself was supposed to be convincing. I stood there listening, staring at a loose bolt I'd already tightened twice that morning. They needed my hands, my time, my silence. They didn't need me. I said I was busy. That was it. Just 2 words. The line went quiet for a second. Then the temperature changed. "So this is what it's going to be now. You know what's at stake. I thought you cared about this family." There it was. The shift. The moment help turned into obligation. When you stop giving what people are used to taking, they don't call it a boundary. They call it betrayal. I could hear it in her voice. Calm, but sharpened. Like disappointment dressed up as concern. My father took the phone after that. He spoke slower, He always did when he wanted to sound reasonable. "You're overthinking this," he said. "This isn't the time to make things difficult. Everyone's under pressure. Everyone. Except the one they were calling." I looked around the yard, the half-painted hull, the open ledger on the bench, the empty coffee cup I'd forgotten to refill hours ago. Everything here existed because I showed up when other people didn't. I realized something then. They weren't asking me to help. They were asking me to keep absorbing consequences so they wouldn't have to. I said no again, more clearly this time. The reaction was immediate. "You've changed. This isn't like you. I don't recognize you anymore." As if saying no erased everything I'd already done. That's how it works. The moment you stop being useful, your entire history gets rewritten. Your sacrifices become invisible. Your limits become character flaws. They didn't mention the nights I stayed up fixing problems no one else noticed. They didn't mention the paperwork with my name on it. They didn't mention how often things only worked because I was there. They mentioned loyalty. They mentioned gratitude. They mentioned how disappointed they were. I felt my chest tighten, the same way it always did when guilt was being handed to me like a responsibility. For a moment, I almost took it. Old habits don't disappear quietly. But something had shifted. I thought about how often I'd been told I was strong, independent, capable. How those words were always used when something needed to be done, never when I needed support. Strength, I realized, had become the excuse. If you're listening and you've ever been called selfish for resting, or cold for setting a boundary, you know this feeling. The confusion, the second-guessing, the urge to explain yourself until you're exhausted again. I didn't explain. I let the silence sit. My mother filled it with more words, warnings, consequences, what people would think, what might fall apart. She wasn't wrong. Things would fall apart, just not mine. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt exposed, like I'd stepped out from under something heavy and wasn't sure what would happen next. I sat down on an overturned crate and stared at my hands. They were shaking slightly, not from fear, from stopping. There's a moment when you realize how much of your identity has been built around being needed. When that disappears, even briefly, it leaves a hollow space. That's when the accusations came in messages, short ones, sharp ones, some pretending to joke, some not bothering. "You're really going to do this now? After everything we've done for you, I hope you can live with yourself." I didn't respond. I picked up my phone and recorded a short video of the boat as it was. The loose fittings, the unfinished details, evidence of work that hadn't been done yet. Work they expected me to complete without question. I saved it. I didn't send it. Not yet. That night, I went home earlier than usual. The fridge was still mostly empty. The silence felt different this time. Louder, less familiar. I sat at the table and thought about how easily care turns into control when no one ever pushes back. How generosity becomes a trap when it's assumed instead of appreciated. They would call again. I knew that. The stakes were too high for them to let this go. But for the first time, I wasn't bracing myself to fix it. I was waiting to see what would happen when I didn't. And that scared them more than anything I had ever done before. Ethan Cole showed up without warning. No phone call ahead of time. No announcement. He didn't arrive like someone trying to impress anyone. He walked into the boatyard like a man who expected things to make sense and planned to notice when they didn't. His shoes were clean. That stood out. Everything else around us smelled like salt, oil, and wet wood. He paused near the entrance, took a slow look around, and didn't say anything at first. That silence stretched longer than anyone was comfortable with. My parents noticed immediately. My mother adjusted her posture. My father cleared his throat. My sister smiled, the way people do when they're nervous but trying to look confident. Ethan didn't smile back. He asked a simple question. Who's responsible for the structural work on these boats? No one answered. He waited. My mother glanced at my father. My father looked at my sister. My sister looked at her phone, then at me. I didn't speak. Ethan nodded slightly, like he'd expected this. He took off his jacket and set it on a chair that had paint stains older than him. Then he opened his bag and pulled out a folder. It wasn't dramatic. No slam on the table, no pointed gestures, just paper, clean edges, organized tabs, evidence. He placed the folder down and flipped it open. These modifications, he said, tapping the page, kept 3 vessels operational last winter when others failed. I recognized the diagrams immediately. Reinforced joints, adjusted load distribution, changes I'd made quietly after hours. The kind of work no one noticed unless it went wrong. Ethan looked up. Who designed these? Again, silence. I could feel my heart beating in my ears, but my face stayed still. Years of practice had taught me how to do that. He didn't push. He turned another page. These contracts, he continued, were submitted to an account with limited access. He paused. They were declined without explanation. My father shifted. There must be some confusion, he said. We handle a lot of correspondence. Ethan didn't respond to the tone. He responded to the facts. These offers were time-sensitive, he said, and profitable. He pointed to a date, then another. They were never forwarded. My mother stepped in. Her voice was calm, too calm. We were protecting her, she said. She's already under so much pressure. Ethan finally looked at me, not with sympathy, not with judgment, just acknowledgement. Were you aware of these offers, he asked? I shook my head once. That was all it took. Ethan closed the folder halfway, then opened it again, slower this time, like he wanted everyone to see exactly what was inside. Access logs, email redirects, authorization signatures, names, dates, consequences. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The truth sat there between us, heavier than any argument could have been. My sister tried to laugh it off. This is getting blown out of proportion, she said. We're family. Ethan didn't even glance at her. Family doesn't override liability, he said quietly. That sentence landed harder than anything else. People think confrontations are loud. They imagine shouting, tears, someone finally snapping. But real shifts don't come from emotion. They come from documentation. Ethan wasn't there to take sides. He was there to understand why things worked when they shouldn't have, and why progress stalled when it shouldn't have. He asked another question. Who currently has authority to approve technical changes? No one answered. Not because they didn't know, because they did. I felt something in my chest loosen, not relief, recognition. For years, every mistake had quietly become mine to fix. Every success had floated upward, detached from the hands that made it happen. I'd absorbed consequences so smoothly that no one realized they were being shielded. Until now. Ethan turned to my father. You had access to the account, he said, not accusatory, just precise. My father nodded. Yes, and you redirected communications. Ethan continued. Without consent. My father stopped talking. Ethan turned to my mother. You were aware of this? She hesitated. That was new. I was trying to keep things stable, she said. Ethan nodded again. Stability built on misrepresentation doesn't hold. No one argued after that. The silence that followed wasn't the familiar kind. This wasn't avoidance or dismissal. This was exposure, the kind that happens when a story collapses under its own weight. I realized then that no amount of explaining would have changed this. No emotional plea, no perfectly worded conversation. All those years I'd thought, if I just say it right, they'll understand. Understanding was never the problem. Accountability was. Ethan gathered the papers back into the folder. He didn't rush. He didn't linger. He simply stood and said, "Moving forward, communication will be direct." He looked at me. "All approvals will come through you." That was it. No speech, no dramatic declaration, just a shift in power that had been overdue for years. After he left, the yard felt smaller, like the walls had moved in without anyone noticing. My sister stared at her phone. My father sat down heavily. My mother folded her hands, then unfolded them, then folded them again. She said my name. I didn't answer. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaking. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't before, like my feet were finally on solid ground instead of constantly adjusting to keep everything balanced. For the first time, the truth wasn't something I carried alone. I thought about every night I'd gone home exhausted, wondering if I was imagining things, wondering if I was too sensitive, too rigid, too much. I wasn't. The system had been built to run on my silence. And silence, once broken by evidence, doesn't grow back the same way. My mother tried to speak again. She said we should talk privately, that this didn't need to go further, that people didn't need to know. I looked at the folder on the table. They already do, I said, because the truth had been recorded. That night, I went home and opened my laptop. I organized my files, old invoices, old messages, logs I'd never thought to keep before. I labeled everything by date. Evidence, not out of spite, out of clarity. I cooked myself dinner and sat at the table. The fridge wasn't full, but it wasn't empty. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel hollow. For the first time, the silence felt earned. I knew what would come next. Conversations, damage control, accusations dressed up as concern. But the hard part was already over. The truth had done its job, and it hadn't needed to shout. I didn't say anything after that. There was nothing left to explain. The truth had already landed, and everyone in the room felt it. Words would only soften the edges, and I didn't want that. I waited until the yard emptied out, until the boat stopped creaking and the tide settled into something quieter. The air felt different, like it does after a storm passes but before anyone starts cleaning up. I walked back into the workshop alone. The first thing I noticed was how familiar everything was. The workbench, the ledger, the hook where I always hung my jacket. These weren't symbols to anyone else. They were habits, muscle memory, proof of how long I'd been here. I took my access card out of my pocket and held it for a second longer than necessary. It was scratched, faded. It had opened every door in this place for years. I placed it on the desk. Then I took the keys, the ones to the dock gate, the storage lockers, the office no one else ever wanted to manage. They made a small sound when I set them down, louder than I expected. No speech, no announcement, just placement. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. I felt steady. Like I was finally moving at the same pace my decisions had been waiting for. Noah was still there, finishing up a repair he'd stayed late to handle. He looked up when he saw me, concern flickering across his face like he was about to ask if I was okay. I didn't answer that question. I handed him the clipboard instead, the one with the schedules, the approvals, the notes I kept for myself because no one else paid attention to details. These are up to date, I said. Nothing's missing. He looked at me, then at the desk, then back at me. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask if I was sure. That's how I knew I'd chosen the right person. I showed him where everything was stored, which suppliers could be trusted, which repairs couldn't wait, which ones people liked to postpone until they became emergencies. He listened. He always had. I wasn't giving anything away. I was returning things to where they belonged. Outside. My mother called my name. Not sharp, not soft, careful. I didn't respond. There are moments when silence isn't avoidance. It's closure. She stepped closer, stopped short of the door. She said we needed to talk, that we could figure something out, that this didn't have to be so final. I tightened one last bolt and wiped my hands on a rag that had already seen too much use. This is figured out, I said. That was the first sentence I'd spoken since everything unraveled. She started to say something else. I didn't stay to hear it. I walked past her, past the place where I'd stood 1,000 times waiting for instructions, waiting for approval, waiting to be needed again. Outside, the light was already fading. Boats bobbed gently, secured by lines I'd tied myself. Everything was stable, not because I was holding it together, because it had been built to stand. I paused at the gate and looked back once. For years, I thought leaving meant destroying something. Walking away felt like failure, like abandoning responsibility. I see now that I wasn't walking away from work. I was walking away from unlimited access. There's a difference. At home, I set my phone down and didn't check it again. Messages could wait. Reactions could wait. I made dinner. Simple, quiet. Something I didn't have to rush through. I sat at the table and noticed how strange it felt to eat without watching the clock. If you're listening to this and wondering whether stepping back makes you cruel, ask yourself something else. Who benefits from your constant availability? Who gets to rest because you don't? I didn't block anyone that night. I didn't make declarations. I just closed a door that had never been mine to leave open in the first place. Power doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like returning keys. And for the first time, I slept without bracing for a call that would pull me back in. The yard would keep running. So would I. Just not on the same terms anymore. 1 year later, people assumed everything was better. They always do. From the outside, it looked clean. I had my own place. A smaller job, fewer responsibilities. When people asked how I was doing, I said fine, and meant it in the most literal way possible. I was functioning, but leaving didn't fix me overnight. It didn't wrap things up neatly. It didn't come with relief music playing in the background. Some nights were quiet in a way that felt wrong. I would wake up at 2 out of habit, heart racing, convinced I'd missed a call or forgotten something urgent. My phone would be face down on the table, silent, still. That took getting used to. There were mornings I stood in my kitchen staring at the sink, trying to remember who I was supposed to take care of first. It took me a while to realize the answer was me, and that felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible. I questioned myself more than once, wondered if I'd overreacted, if I'd misunderstood things. If I'd been too harsh by stepping back without explanation, without closure, without one last attempt to be understood. That doubt didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of being taught that my value was measured by how much I carried without complaint. Cutting off access didn't erase that conditioning. It just stopped feeding it. There were still empty spaces. Holidays passed quietly. Invitations stopped coming. I learned which relationships only existed because I was useful. That part hurt more than I expected. But the pain was different, cleaner. It didn't twist itself into guilt or obligation. It didn't demand I fix it. This was the kind of pain that told the truth. I started noticing small things instead. The way my shoulders relaxed when I locked my door at night. The way I could make plans without checking who might need me. The way my name felt when no one was calling it like a command. I kept a notebook that year. Not for work, not for reminders. Just observations. What it felt like to say no. What it felt like to be alone without being abandoned. What it felt like to rest without earning it first. Some days I wrote nothing. Some days I filled pages. Healing wasn't loud. It wasn't linear. It didn't look impressive. It looked like cooking for one and not apologizing for it. It looked like letting messages sit unanswered without panic. It looked like understanding that cutting ties didn't end the pain. It just ended the confusion. If you're listening to this and you're still in the middle of it, still holding everything together while telling yourself it's not that bad, I want you to hear this clearly. Walking away doesn't mean you stop hurting. It means you stop hurting for the wrong reasons. There's a difference between pain that drains you and pain that teaches you where your limits are. One keeps you stuck. The other sets boundaries. I didn't reconcile with everyone. Some bridges stayed burned. Some questions never got answered. I had to accept that closure isn't always mutual. Sometimes closure is quiet. Sometimes it's just the absence of chaos. I no longer measure my worth by how indispensable I am. I don't confuse being needed with being loved. That took time. And I still have moments where the old instincts flare up, where I want to step in, smooth things over, fix what isn't mine anymore. But now I pause. I ask myself one question before I act. What are the consequences if I stay silent? And for the first time, I include myself in the answer. If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, if you're the one everyone leans on while quietly erasing you, you're not imagining it. You're not weak for feeling tired, and you're not cruel for wanting space. Leaving isn't easy. It's not heroic. It's not clean. But neither is staying somewhere that requires you to disappear in order to belong. If you're carrying more than your share right now, take this as permission to put something down. Even if it's just one thing, even if it's just for today. And if this resonated with you, if you saw yourself somewhere in this story, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. You're not alone in this, even when you finally choose yourself.